Well, hi there. My name is Perry, and welcome to the Literary Knitterary. Hello, my friends, and welcome to day 5 of 12 Days of Classics. Today I read books 9 and 10 of the Odyssey. Is that how math works? I kind of feel like books 9 and 10 are where you start to get into the real meat of the Odyssey, where you start to get into the details of Odysseus' actual journey back from Troy, and also many of the episodes that have had the greatest impact on sort of popular culture. I remember being almost disappointed the first time I read the Odyssey and found out comparatively how little, narrative weight and even stage time certain incidents that I remembered from my child version of the Odyssey that I enjoyed as a kid. But anyway, in book 9, Odysseus begins to tell his story as requested by King Alcinous. First, Odysseus says he and his men are blown off course towards the land of the Citations, where they sack their cities, basically, and Odysseus says he wanted to leave right away, but his men wanted to sit on the beach and drink wine and enjoy their spoils. So then, of course, the Citations called in reinforcements, and there was a battle, and a couple of men died, but the rest of them escaped. As they leave, they're caught in a storm, and they end up in the land of the Lotus Eaters, where several of his men sent out as scouts eat of the food, eat of the lotus with the Lotus Eaters, and lose their desire to return home. Odysseus collects those men, and they set off once again. And then they end up in the land of the Cyclops, or I guess I should be saying the Cyclopes, since there's more than one of them. And this is one of those very famous episodes. In broad strokes, Odysseus and 12 of his men enter the cave of one of the Cyclopes. The men kind of want to leave immediately, but Odysseus wants to stay to see if he can get any gifts from his host. But when Polyphemus turns up, he just starts eating Odysseus's men, and he blocks the entrance to his cave with a huge rock that none of them can hope to move. So Odysseus has to rely on trickery. He gets the Cyclops drunk with wine, sharpens his walking stick into a spear and heats it in the fire, and uses it to stab out the Cyclops' eye. But of course, he's already told Polyphemus that his name is Nobody or No Man. So when Polyphemus screams out in pain and the other Cyclopes ask him what's wrong, he says, "No man is hurting me," and they're all like, "Oh, so you're fine then." Then of course they escape from the cave of the Cyclops by clinging to the bellies of his herd of sheep. And as the ship is pulling away from shore, Odysseus just can't help but yell back to Polyphemus to taunt him and make sure that he knows exactly who got the best of him. Polyphemus is not super happy about this and calls on his father Poseidon to punish Odysseus for the wrongs he has done him. After that, they make it to the island of Aeolus, where they are met with good hospitality, and their host gives them a bag of winds to help them get home. So he gives them a favorable wind and puts all the other winds in the bag so they can't get out and cause any trouble. But when they're literally within sight of Ithaca, Odysseus falls asleep, and all of his men are like, "I bet that bag is full of treasure." Odysseus keeps keeping all the treasure for himself, and we want some treasure. So they open the bag, all the winds escape, they get blown all over the place, basically back to where they started. Odysseus goes back into Aeolus and is like, "Hey, do you think you could help me out again?" And Aeolus is like, "Goddamn, for you to be back here signifies that you are so unlucky that the gods must literally hate you, and I do not want to get mixed up in that." So he yells at them and they have to go away. And then they run into some real trouble in the land of the Laestrygonians. They come upon what looks like a town, and most of Odysseus's men choose to moor their ships in the harbor. Odysseus, for no apparent reason, decides to tie his to a rock outside of the harbor. They go to see who lives in this town, and it turns out it's a town full of cannibalistic giants. So they're trying to leave as quickly as possible, as one would. But the giants are actively hunting them and spearing men off of the boats like fish out of the water. So only one ship, the ship with Odysseus on it, makes it out of there. And then they make it to the island, which has quite possibly the most terrifying name to try to pronounce, and that is the island of Aeaea, which is where Circe lives. They see the smoke from her dwelling, and half of the crew is sent to go check it out, but of course all of them are turned into pigs. One of them makes it out to go report back to the rest of the group, and Odysseus is like, "Well, I guess I have to go sort this out." And on his way, he happens to run into Hermes, who just very conveniently gives him all of the information that he needs to deal successfully with Circe. So she tries to turn him into a pig too, but he already has the antidote because Hermes gave it to him. So he basically turns the tables on her, and she's like, "Okay, I'll turn all your men back into people, and I'll be nice to you forever. You win." So they stay with her for a year, recuperating, and then finally Odysseus is like, "Okay, it's time for me to get going." And Circe says, "Well, before you get going, before you can go home, you're going to have to go down into the underworld and talk to the prophet Tiresias, who is dead." So she gives him all of the instructions about what he needs to do to be able to do that, which we'll talk about tomorrow when he actually does it, and he basically rounds up all of his men and he's like, "Okay, it's time to go." And that is the end of book 10. I also continued on in the introduction, reading sections entitled "When Was the Odyssey Composed?", "Homer's World," and friends, strangers, guests. We are going to be talking mostly about the Polyphemus episode with some insights from the introduction to sort of structure that conversation. So talking again about the concept of hospitality and also sort of about the concept of exploring different ways of structuring a society. So there's some interesting language at the beginning of the Polyphemus episode. First of all, Odysseus makes an extremely lengthy description of the island of the Cyclopes and basically how they are not utilizing its agricultural potential. As I've already mentioned, I don't remember when, the Cyclopes do not farm, they only herd animals, yet things like grapes and grain just grow straight out of the ground. So Odysseus knows all of these things, like the apparent fertility of the soil and the abundance of fresh water, and the topography of the area, which is well suited for both vineyards and growing of grain. And he goes on to say that in addition to not farming, the Cyclopes have no laws, no ships, and no knowledge of custom. There's another island right across the way from the island of the Cyclopes that actually is not inhabited by any sentient creatures. It just has like sheep and goats on it. And it's that island that they go to first, but Odysseus is determined to explore the island of the Cyclopes, which is right across the way. And when justifying that decision to his crew, he says, "My loyal friends, stay here the rest of you, while with my boat and crew I go to check who these men are, find out if they are wild, lawless aggressors or the type to welcome strangers and fear the gods." It's interesting that he explicitly states that his motivation is to find out what kind of people these are and what their customs are. And it's also interesting that he sets these two things up as mutually exclusive, diametrically opposed opposites, right? Either you are a lawless aggressor who actively wants to harm me, or you will be nice to me because you are a good person and you fear the gods and you're pious. Those are the options. Later on, as I said, they're in the cave of Polyphemus and they see like his cheese and some other stuff lying around, and the men are like, what if we just steal some cheese and go back to the boats and we don't ever need to talk to anybody? And Odysseus says, no. I hoped to see him and find out if he would give us gifts. So he's explicitly trying to engage in the rituals of guest friendship that we've seen carried out in the Odyssey previously, when Telemachus visits Nestor and Menelaus and when Odysseus is welcomed by the Phaeacians, right? And this is where I want to start referencing the introduction. So Wilson points out that while we can't precisely pinpoint the date of the Odyssey's composition or codification or like precipitation out of oral culture or different versions of the poem, we can get kind of close within a 50 or 100 year range, and that 50 or 100 year range corresponds with the beginning of a wave of Greek projects of colonization, of expansion, where they were leaving their homes and going out to settle other places, many of which would already have been inhabited. She outlines how the rituals of guest friendship that we've already seen in earlier books of the Odyssey are basically like an old-timey form of networking with the expectation of future reciprocity. If you ever turn up to my house, I'll take care of you and feed you and give you gifts because you were nice to me. And this is especially important in a world with no hotels. But also she points out that these rituals of guest friendship are the means by which unrelated elite families can connect to one another as equals without having to fight for dominance. But of course, when Polyphemus shows up and refuses to participate in these rituals, a fight for dominance is exactly what ensues. Also, while Odysseus presents Polyphemus's unwillingness to participate in these rituals as unreasonable, barbaric, and obviously monstrous, in that he literally begins to eat people, it's not clear why Polyphemus would have any motivation to participate in them. The Cyclopes don't build ships, they don't explore, they're not trying to expand their networks of power and influence the way the Greeks were at the time when this poem was being composed, codified, put together. Moreover, Polyphemus's portrayal throughout this incident is somewhat inconsistent. At first, when Odysseus says, "Hey, I'm at your house, give me some stuff," Polyphemus basically says, "Why should I do that?" And Odysseus says, "Well, like, because the gods like it when you do that." And Polyphemus says, "Puh, puh, 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 I don't fear the gods." But before that, Odysseus told us that the fertile land and self-propagating crops that the Cyclopes are blessed with are gifts from the gods themselves, and after Polyphemus has been blinded, he calls on his father, Poseidon, to curse Odysseus. So the relationship that the Cyclopes have with the gods, at least the way Odysseus himself presents it, is inconsistent. And there are other inconsistencies as well. For example, Odysseus says that they don't care for each other, but as soon as Polyphemus cries out in pain, other Cyclopes come down and ask him if he's okay. He claims that the Cyclopes have no knowledge of customs because they do not seem to care very much about his customs. Basically, Wilson argues that this episode can be seen as a person, Odysseus, arguing to justify his own behavior in exploiting and doing violence against people whose land he's walked onto. Or, in other words, a colonizer trying to justify colonization. Wilson goes on to argue, and this kind of blew my mind a little bit, that the different places and peoples that Odysseus encounters that end badly or violently for him and his men are not just a catalog of different ways of structuring a civilization, but specifically a series of different perversions of the rituals of guest friendship. So again, think of the patterns we've seen in the first few books of the Odyssey in the houses of Nestor, Menelaus, and Alcinous. The guest is welcomed, washed by women, given an honorable and comfortable place to sit, and offered food and wine. Only after he has eaten and had some wine is he asked to tell his story. The visitor is then given lodging for the night, and when it is time to leave, the host provides gifts and some practical help with an onward journey. So she also points out that providing help with the next leg of the trip, or Pompeii in Greek, sending, is an important component of hospitality. So, for example, Nestor gives Telemachus a carriage and his son Pisistratus as a guide before he sends him on to Menelaus' house. He says, here's what you should go, here's what you should do, here's how you're going to get there. And when Telemachus is leaving Menelaus, he says to force a visitor to stay is just as bad as pushing him to go. So this leave-taking is also an important part of the rituals of hospitality. So if we think about the places Odysseus has been that have gone badly for him, at each of them there's been a breakdown of some sort in some stage of this process, right? Skipping over the Sicanies because that was kind of their fault, but you could argue that they overstayed their welcome by not getting out as soon as they were done pillaging. In the land of the Lotus Eaters, the guests are offered food, but it's food that makes them forget their desire for home, which is a breakdown of leave-taking. With Polyphemus, pretty much everything goes wrong. He eats them instead of feeding them, he doesn't give gifts, and he makes it very difficult for them to leave. Aeolus provides Odysseus with a mode of leave-taking that is arguably too powerful for him and his men to handle, the bag of winds that blows them all the way back to their starting point if it's open. The Laestrygonians once again eat their guests instead of feeding them, which is just bad manners. And Circe once again offers food that makes her guests forget their desire to return home, so a corruption of leave-taking, and then turns them into pigs, which again is just bad manners. Similarly, Odysseus' stay with Calypso is a failure of leave-taking because he wants to go home and she keeps him on her island for 7 years. There are other parallels as well with episodes that we haven't gotten to yet. For example, Wilson argues that the sirens provide entertainment so beautiful and enchanting that once again the guest loses their desire to return home. So a corruption of the provision of song or entertainment leads to a corruption of leave-taking. Finally, Wilson points out that the suitors who are overstaying their welcome in Odysseus' home while he himself is not there to kick them out and send them away are also perverting the customs of hospitality, which is even more interesting when she points out that some of the words used to describe the suitors and their consumption, words with meanings like self-indulgent, heedless, and overbearing, are the same words used to describe the Cyclopes and the Laestrygonians, who literally eat people. The suitors who are eating Odysseus out of house and home while he basically can't defend himself against them are committing a crime on the same level as the cannibals that the poem portrays. I think this is a super interesting way of reading the poem that builds off of ideas that I had encountered before in really exciting ways. I think it provides an interesting dimension to the repeated incidents in the poem where something happens and someone loses their desire to return home, which, since the entire poem is about trying to return home, always struck me as pretty significant. I would love to know what you think about this conversation about the Odyssey as a colonialist apology or as a catalog of failures of hospitality. Or if that sounds too complicated but you want to let me know that you are here, you can just leave me an emoji in the comments down below. If you like this video, I do hope you'll consider subscribing, and I will see you again soon. But in the meantime, I hope that everyone is staying happy, healthy, and safe, and I hope that somewhere out there there's a great book waiting just for you. Bye!